Since the election of the Albanese government 3 months ago, almost to the day, it's been non-stop chatter about renewables, net zero and carbon emissions. The pinnacle, of course, was the government's climate change bill. That's 43% legislated emissions reductions by 2030. You can thank the Labor-Greens alliance for that. Now, this bill's already passed the lower house and is expected to pass the Senate when Parliament returns shortly. But for a major piece of legislation, there is very little detail. As Australia faces a worsening energy crisis, left-wing green activist groups are salivating. As a new report shows, almost $100 billion in critical resources projects are at risk. Australia, fasten your seatbelt. It's going to be a bumpy ride. And joining me now to explain what's at risk is Deputy Executive Director at the IPA, Daniel Wild. Daniel, the bill is not yet law, but we've already seen a push from activist groups like the Environment Council of Central Queensland and Environmental Justice Australia, and they want to reconsider 19 critical resources projects. Will this bill just open up the floodgates to leftist litigation?
You're right, Rita. This bill will unleash a torrent of green activism and lawfare, more red tape and court delays of critical projects at a time, as you rightly identify, where we have a critical energy shortage across Australia with skyrocketing prices. And green groups have already started writing to the Federal Environment Minister, asking her to reconsider approvals which had previously been given to 19 projects around Australia, which, as you said, at about $100 billion cost, 175,000 jobs at risk. And importantly, 14 of those 19 projects are in North Queensland, with the remainder across other parts of regional Australia. So this is yet another hit to our suburbs and our regions who have already suffered so much.
Now, can you tell me what kind of projects are at risk here, Daniel? Are we talking gas exploration, new mines? What sort of projects?
Well, it's a good question. Essentially, any project which emits carbon is on the chopping block. It's a coal mine, dam, infrastructure such as road construction or railroads, anything which emits carbon. And the reason for that is, under current legislation, anything which is quote unquote a relevant consideration as it relates to ministerial approvals of major projects must be taken into account. Now, the legislation of net zero will become a relevant consideration. Now, in simple terms, what that means is that when a minister decides whether or not a project can go ahead, the minister must take into account how that project may affect Australia's commitment, which will now be in legislation, to net zero. And as you can imagine, that entails almost any significant project across Australia.
This is just spectacular acts of self-harm. We are doing this damage to our own country, to our own citizens and industry. It's incredible. And the lefty activists, well, they're continuing their tirade, but we've got Australian businesses and, in fact, even the unions are calling for the moratorium on nuclear power to be lifted, Daniel. I mean, that is long overdue. Surely, if we really want to get to net zero by 2030 or 2050, we need to invest in nuclear energy if we're going to maintain living standards.
You're right. There's a couple of points I make is, firstly, yes, absolutely, we must remove the ban on nuclear energy. We know that Australians want the ban to be removed. A recent poll we undertook found that around 53% of Australians agreed that Australia should be building nuclear power plants. As you know, about 70% of France's energy comes from nuclear. It's around 20% in the UK and similar numbers in Canada as well. So absolutely, we must be opening up nuclear power in Australia. But the other point I'd make is that that is a long-term fix to our problems. We need short-term fixes in the here and now, and that means getting more coal and more gas onto the market under net zero. We know there's at least 6 more coal-fired power stations which will close down by 2030. Now, rather than closing down coal-fired power stations, we need to be expanding the existing stations we have and building new ones as an immediate term fix to this chronic shortage that we now have.
Yep, we're closing them down and China's building hundreds more. And yeah, we'll see where both countries are in 20 years and in 50 years' time. Daniel Wild, thank you so much for joining me tonight.